The phone rang, and when I saw his name on the screen, I never expected the words that would follow. I'm leaving you. For her. I froze, unable to breathe as he told me he was moving to Spain with the woman he'd been seeing behind my back. I thought it was a nightmare, but the shocking truth, that was only the beginning. What happened next turned my world upside down and forced me to confront a reality I never imagined and a future I never saw coming. The morning light barely pierced through the curtains of our bedroom, the beige fabric fraying at the edges. I had never noticed it before, the way the sun's rays filtered in, soft but distant, like everything in my life had become. I stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the empty space beside me. It wasn't the first time he'd been gone overnight, but it felt different this time. The air in the room was thick with something unspoken, something that had been lingering for weeks, months maybe. I ran my fingers across the sheets, still warm from where he'd slept just a few hours earlier, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had always known our marriage was imperfect. We were two people who had somehow drifted into each other's lives, not necessarily out of love, but out of convenience. The whirlwind romance that everyone talks about, we never had it. We were both too busy with our careers, too focused on what was expected of us. For years I'd justified it. We were both doing well, we had our routine, and I convinced myself that was enough. But now, standing in the middle of our shared space, I couldn't deny the gnawing emptiness that had begun to settle into my bones. It was as if all the pieces of my life, the ones I had worked so hard to put together, were suddenly out of place. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe it was just a phase. Maybe he was just stressed. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew. I knew this wasn't just about late nights at work or the occasional weekend trip. It had become something more, something I couldn't ignore any longer. The sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand snapped me back to reality. I walked over to it, the feeling of the hardwood floor cool beneath my feet. The screen lit up with a message from a number I didn't recognize. Dorothy, I think it's time we talk. There's no easy way to say this. I'm moving to Spain with Emma. I'm so sorry. Emma. My world tilted. I stood frozen, unable to move. The words on the screen blurred in front of me, the weight of them sinking into my chest like stones. Spain. With her. His mistress. I don't even remember picking up the phone, but there I was, staring at the message. It felt like time itself had stopped. I could hear his voice in my head now, the way he'd always been so confident, so sure of himself. Always the one with the answers. Always the one who had it all figured out. But this was different. This was betrayal in its rawest form. It wasn't the affair I had imagined. It wasn't some fleeting mistake. This was something planned, something calculated. He was leaving me for her, and he was taking everything. Our life, our future, everything we had built together and throwing it all away. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at the walls, at the ceiling, at the entire universe for letting this happen. But all I could do was stand there, frozen, my hands trembling, as the phone slipped from my fingers and crashed to the floor. The silence in the room was deafening. There was no comfort in the familiar, no reassurance in the routine, only the stark, undeniable truth. He was gone, and it was only just beginning to sink in. I didn't cry at first. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, as if the floor beneath me might swallow me whole. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't make sense of it. Every second felt like an eternity as I tried to process the message. My mind raced, jumping from one thought to the next, as if by thinking faster I could somehow outrun the truth. Spain. Emma. The two words echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull like a cruel, unrelenting drumbeat. I kept trying to piece together the signs, the moments I should have seen coming, his long nights at the office, The business trips he'd never told me about, the late night phone calls he'd insisted on taking in private. My mind began to flash through every moment, searching for answers, looking for proof of the thing I had refused to acknowledge. All along, there had been a part of me, deep down, that sensed something was off, but I had ignored it, too scared to face the truth. And now here I was, standing in the wreckage of everything I had ever known, wondering how I had been so blind. I walked to the kitchen, my legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, the same smell that had greeted me every morning for the last 5 years. I turned on the kettle automatically, my hands working mechanically. The sound of boiling water filled the silence, but it did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. My phone was still on the floor, its screen cracked, but still glowing with the last message from him. I picked it up slowly, as if the very act of touching it would burn me. "I'm so sorry." Those words taunted me. Sorry. Sorry for breaking my heart. Sorry for destroying everything we had built. Sorry for tearing apart the life we had planned together. I could feel the anger rising within me, but it was a distant, cold kind of fury. Not the kind of anger that burns hot and quick, but the kind that settles deep inside, like a poison that seeps into your bones. My hands gripped the edge of the counter as I leaned over it, staring at nothing in particular. For the first time in a long while, I felt utterly alone. The life I had built for myself was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The thought of him with her, of him starting a new life, building new memories in a place where I would never be, made my stomach turn. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told me over the years? I had believed in him, trusted him. He was my partner, my best friend. And now, in one cruel stroke, he had torn everything apart. I had loved him with everything I had, and now it felt like I had been nothing more than a fool. I let out a long breath, trying to calm myself, but it didn't work. The tears began to fall, slow at first, then faster, until I was shaking with the weight of them. My chest ached, a deep, raw pain that I couldn't escape. I slid down to the floor, hugging my knees to my chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to feel the hurt. It was like I was mourning a death, the death of the life I had imagined, the death of the person I had thought I was. As I sat there, sobbing quietly in the kitchen, I realized something I hadn't expected. The pain wasn't just about losing him. It was about losing myself in the process. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Dorothy. I had become his wife, a role I had fallen into without questioning. I had sacrificed pieces of who I was for the sake of the marriage, for the sake of what we were supposed to be. And now, with nothing left, I had to figure out who I was again. But for now, all I could do was sit there and cry, the weight of betrayal crushing down on me. It's funny how you think you know someone, how you think that after years of shared mornings, secrets, promises, you can predict what they'll do, how they'll act. But the truth is, when someone leaves you, when they walk away with no second thoughts, you realize just how little you truly knew about them. The pain of betrayal is never just about the loss of a person. It's about the unraveling of everything you believed to be true. And now, standing in the cold, empty house, I felt like I was being torn apart piece by piece. A few hours after reading the message, I tried to call him. Of course, he didn't pick up. I didn't expect him to, but I had to hear his voice, had to ask him why. Not for any closure, not for any meaningful explanation, just to hear him admit it, to say it out loud, that he was truly leaving me for her. I knew it was a pointless exercise, but in that moment, the desperation inside me was overwhelming. The unanswered calls only made it worse. It was like I was begging for something that no longer existed. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing the house, trying to make sense of everything. I checked his office, his things, anything that might give me answers. I found the flight itinerary tucked in the back of his desk drawer. A one-way ticket to Madrid for the two of them, dated for the following week. I don't know what I expected to find, proof of something I already knew, a sign that this was all just a nightmare and I could wake up from it. But there it was, in black and white, the finality of it all. I wasn't just losing him, I was losing everything that came with him. Our life, our plans, the future I thought we would have. At some point, the phone rang. I didn't have to check the caller ID. I knew it was him. I didn't want to answer it. I wasn't sure I could. My chest tightened, my throat closing up as I stared at the phone. But I had to know. I had to face him. I forced myself to pick up. "Dorothy," he said, his voice so calm, so detached, it made my stomach turn. I I don't even know what to say," I whispered. The words caught in my throat. "How could you do this to me? To us?" "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice almost mechanical. "I never wanted to hurt you, but I've met someone else. She makes me happy in a way that, well, I didn't know was possible." Someone else? Those words hit me harder than anything else. There was no apology for the years we'd spent together, no regret for the life he was walking away from. Just an acceptance, a finality, that it was over. "Do you love her?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. It wasn't a question I needed the answer to. It was more of a plea, a last attempt to find some humanity in the man I had once loved so deeply. He paused. I I do. I'm sorry, Dorothy, but I can't keep pretending." The finality in his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Pretending. He had been pretending. All those years, all the laughter, all the moments we shared, was it all just a lie to him? Was I nothing more than a placeholder? My heart shattered with the weight of that thought. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't let him hear how broken I felt. I couldn't let him see how deep his betrayal had cut. "So, this is it then," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're really going." There was a long pause. I could hear him sigh on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Dorothy. I wish it could have been different." And with that, the call ended. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen. The weight of the last words hung in the air, thick with bitterness. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some dramatic farewell, or a tearful plea for forgiveness. But in the end, it was just a simple, unemotional goodbye. No fight, no final confrontation. Just the reality that my marriage, my entire world, was slipping away from me in a way I couldn't stop. I didn't feel angry in that moment. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel anything at all. I just felt hollow, empty, like a shell of the person I had once been. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that would never be mine again. There was nothing left here for me. But in that hollow emptiness, something else began to stir. A small spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Something had to change, and it had to start with me. I didn't know how I would rebuild my life. I didn't know what I would do next. But for the first time since that phone call, I knew one thing. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't stay in a house that held only the ghosts of the past. I didn't know where I would go, but I knew I had to leave. And as I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, I realized something that shook me to my core. This was my chance to start over. And no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much I feared the unknown, I had to take it. The next few days were a blur. The days had started to stretch on endlessly, and the nights were filled with a silence I had never known before. The house was a mausoleum of memories, filled with reminders of everything I had lost. I spent hours sitting in the living room, staring at the walls, barely able to move. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me in a way I couldn't explain. How could someone I trusted so completely, someone I had spent so much of my life with, so casually walk away? I tried not to look at his things. His shirts hanging in the closet, his shoes lined up neatly by the door, the toiletries still in the bathroom. They felt like daggers, reminders of a life I was no longer part of. I couldn't bring myself to pack them up or even look at them for too long. Part of me kept thinking that if I left them there, if I kept his things in place, maybe he'd come back. Maybe this was just a bad dream, and I'd wake up to find that everything was still the way it was before. But deep down, I knew it was over. I couldn't stay in this place. It wasn't just the house. It was the life. It was everything I had built around the illusion of a happy marriage. I had to leave. I had to move, to find something else. But the thought of starting over terrified me. Where did I even begin? I took a walk that afternoon, trying to clear my mind. The streets seemed foreign now, as if everything around me had changed. The sun shone down, the air crisp, but I felt detached from everything, like I was walking through a world that didn't belong to me anymore. I found myself at a park near our house, a place we used to visit on weekends. I sat on a bench, watching families and children playing, their laughter echoing in the distance. It felt like they were a different species altogether, people who still believed in the beauty of life, in the normalcy of things. As I sat there, I realized how far I had drifted from everything that had once made sense. I had been so wrapped up in him, in our life, in the plans we'd made, that I had lost myself along the way. I had given up my career, my dreams, all for the sake of a future that now felt completely unattainable. I had let myself disappear into the role of wife, and somewhere along the way, I had forgotten how to be Dorothy, the woman who had dreams and ambitions, the woman who had once believed in herself. It was then that I made a decision, one I hadn't thought I'd be capable of. I wasn't going to let this be the end, not for me. Not after everything. I didn't know what the future held, and I was terrified of facing it alone, but I knew I had to try. I had to start over, even if I didn't have a plan yet, even if I didn't have all the answers. I couldn't let him dictate the rest of my life. I couldn't let his betrayal define me. That evening, I started going through my things, slowly at first. It wasn't easy. I found myself pulling out old journals, notes from friends, and articles I had written back when I was still working. It felt like I was unearthing parts of myself I had forgotten about. I hadn't written in years, but as I flipped through the pages of my old journals, I remembered how it felt to put my thoughts into words, to express myself. I had been so focused on the relationship that I had abandoned the things that made me feel alive. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was there. I wasn't sure what direction I would go in, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I couldn't stay in a life that was built on lies. I had to find myself again, somewhere, somehow, and I had to believe that I was worth it. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of a man who had taken everything and walked away without a second glance. I needed a fresh start, and no matter how uncertain it felt, I was going to find it. The first few days after leaving the house felt surreal. I didn't have a destination in mind, but I knew I couldn't stay in the city that had been home to my heartbreak. I ended up renting a small, bare apartment on the edge of town, a place that was small enough for me to disappear into. It was nothing special, no furniture, no decor to remind me of the life I had left behind. The walls were empty, just like I felt inside. The apartment had a single window, and for the first few nights, I spent hours staring out at the street below, watching people go about their lives. It was like watching a world I didn't belong to anymore. But I kept reminding myself that this was part of the process. This was the beginning of something new, even if it didn't feel like it. I spent the next week in a daze, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. There were moments of panic when I realized I didn't even know where to start. I had no job, no plan, and the little savings I had was quickly dwindling. But I kept thinking back to that park, to that moment when I made the decision to move forward, even though I didn't have any idea what that would look like. I knew I had to find something, something that would give me back a sense of purpose. I signed up for an online course, something that had always intrigued me: graphic design. It wasn't a career I had ever considered, but it was a skill I could learn from home, something that would allow me to regain control over my life. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of excitement. It was small, but it was enough to keep me going. I spent hours each day learning, practicing, and relearning how to focus on something that was mine. The lessons were challenging, but with each new thing I mastered, I felt a little more of the old Dorothy coming back to life. But the fear never fully left me. The fear that I was making a mistake, that I was choosing the wrong path, that I would never truly move on. There were days when I couldn't bring myself to open my laptop, when the weight of what had happened felt too heavy to carry. I missed the comfort of my old life, even though it had been built on lies. I missed the familiar rhythm of marriage, even if that rhythm had been a prison. I missed the feeling of belonging to someone, even if that someone had betrayed me. It was on one of those days, when I was scrolling mindlessly through social media, that I saw the first glimpse of him since the day he left. His profile picture had changed, of course, to one of him and Emma, both of them smiling like nothing had ever happened. The sight of them together, their faces so carefree, so happy, sent a wave of nausea through me, but I forced myself to stop scrolling. I refused to let them take up any more space in my life. The old Dorothy wouldn't have let that affect her, and I wasn't going to let it affect me either. I spent the next few weeks immersing myself in my new work. The online course turned into something more, something I began to take seriously. As the days passed, the apartment started to feel like home. I bought some inexpensive furniture, hung a few pictures on the walls, and began to make the space my own. Slowly, the emptiness began to fade, replaced by the faintest glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I wasn't sure where this new path would take me, but I could feel it pulling me forward, away from the past and into the future. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted myself, but I kept pushing through. It was during one of those late nights while I was working on a design for one of my assignments that I got a message from a friend back home. She'd heard about what happened with my husband, and she wanted to check in. I hadn't spoken to her in months, maybe even years, but I took a deep breath and decided to reply. The conversation was brief at first, but then she asked if I'd considered applying for a position at a design agency. I was stunned by the suggestion. It felt like something I hadn't even allowed myself to consider. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. It was a new beginning. It was a chance for me to build something for myself, to prove that I was capable of more than just surviving the aftermath of betrayal. So I did it. I applied. And when I got the call for an interview a few days later, I felt a surge of excitement and terror all at once. It was the first step toward something new, the first real step toward healing, toward creating a future where I wasn't defined by my past mistakes or by someone else's choices, the first step toward finding myself again. I didn't know what would happen after that interview, or if I was even qualified for the position. But for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt like I had control over something. I was creating my own path, and that, I realized, was the most important thing of all. The days that followed were a whirlwind of interviews, portfolio reviews, and self-doubt, but something within me had shifted. I wasn't the same woman who had cried on the floor of our empty house. I wasn't the woman who had spent hours staring at an unresponsive phone, begging for answers. Slowly but surely, I was becoming someone new, someone who could stand on her own 2 feet, who could take risks and embrace change, even if it terrified her. When I finally landed the job at the design agency, I almost didn't believe it. For so long, I had defined myself by my relationship, by the expectations of others. But now I was building something completely new, something that was mine. I threw myself into my work with a passion I hadn't felt in years, staying up late into the night, perfecting designs, learning new techniques. There was an energy in me I hadn't known existed, a feeling of self-worth that had been buried for far too long. Every success, no matter how small, felt like a victory over the past, a testament to my strength. Months went by, and I found myself not just rebuilding my career, but reclaiming my life. My apartment had transformed from a cold, empty space into a home, filled with my own touches, with things that brought me joy. The loneliness that had once suffocated me now felt like a thing of the past. I was making new friends, finding new connections, and starting to laugh again. I was rediscovering the woman I had been before I ever met him, the woman who had dreams and ambitions, the woman who didn't need anyone to define her. Then, one evening, I received an unexpected email. It was from him, my ex-husband. His message was brief, apologetic even, but there was an undertone of regret in his words. He wanted to talk. I didn't respond right away. For a long time, I just stared at the screen. The pain he had caused was still there, but it no longer consumed me. I had moved on, and I didn't need closure from him anymore. A part of me considered replying, just to hear him explain himself, one last time, to see if he felt any of the weight of what he had done. But I realized something as I sat there, staring at his name on the screen. I didn't need his explanation. I had already found the closure I needed. The life I had built in the months since he left had become more than enough. I had become more than enough. I deleted the email without responding. A few weeks later, while I was at a work event, I ran into someone unexpected. It was Emma, the woman he had left me for. At first, I felt that old pang of hurt, that sharp sting of betrayal. But as I looked at her, standing there, dressed in a way that seemed so unfamiliar, something clicked inside me. I didn't feel anger or resentment. I didn't even feel sadness. I just felt nothing. She smiled awkwardly, as if unsure how to approach me, but I didn't need her apology. I didn't need to hear about the life they had built together. I smiled back, polite but distant, and turned away without a second thought. I realized in that moment that my freedom didn't lie in holding on to anger or bitterness. It was in letting go. I didn't need to confront him or her. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I had already proven it to myself. I had survived the worst, and I was stronger for it. The life I had now wasn't perfect. It was still a work in progress, but it was mine. It was built on my own terms, with my own hands, and I was proud of it. As I stood in the middle of my new life, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. 4 years ago, I had been crushed by the weight of betrayal, unsure if I could ever recover. But now, standing tall and smiling genuinely for the first time in a long while, I knew I had rebuilt myself from the ground up. I had found my strength, my independence, and my purpose. And in that, I had found something even more valuable than what I had lost: myself. And for the first time in years, I truly believed I was exactly where I was meant to be.